All right, good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar to learn more about ERA's Carbon Capture Kickstart funding opportunity, a $30 million funding competition we announced alongside the Government of Alberta on January 14th, not quite 2 weeks ago. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to say that ERA respectfully acknowledges that we, in the ERA Edmonton office, are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route for diverse Indigenous peoples, whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence and enrich our vibrant community. We commit to honoring these lands and showing gratitude to the Indigenous peoples whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. For those who don't know me, my name is Mark Summers, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Emissions Reduction Alberta, or ERA. I am the thorn between these two roses on this slide. This morning, I'm joined by Steve MacDonald, ERA's Chief Executive Officer. Good morning, Steve.
Morning, Mark.
And I'm also joined by Justin Wheeler, ERA's Executive Director of Technology and Innovation. Good morning, Justin.
Morning, everyone.
Steve and Justin will be passing the microphone back and forth today, virtually speaking, to talk about our latest call for proposals, Carbon Capture Kickstart. After a short presentation, they'll both be available to answer your questions during the live Q&A period. Before we get into the agenda, I'd like to go through a couple housekeeping items just to make sure we get the most out of our time today. First of all, we're expecting more than 250 participants on the line today. We're at getting up closer to 200 now, so everyone's microphone is muted to avoid unintentional background noise. If you encounter technical challenges related to the webinar connection, please email my colleague Amanda using info@eralberta.ca, and we will try to help where we can. However, if you can't resolve your technical issues or if you need to leave early, please note that we will be posting a recording of this webinar on our website at eralberta.ca. The recording will include both the presentation and the live Q&A with audio. In terms of an agenda for today's webinar, we plan to cover a few items that will hopefully be helpful for everyone on the line. First, Steve will talk briefly about ERA and our mandate as an organization. Next, Justin will provide an overview of the Carbon Capture Kickstart call. We'll cover some key points regarding scope and eligibility, the submission process, and the timelines around ERA's funding decision. This call is a bit unique from our typical challenges, so there are some finer points that you'll want to know. We also provide some advice for anyone that's interested in making a submission. And finally, we'll end off by answering some of your questions. If you have any questions that you'd like us to address, type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. We will answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have, but if we don't address your question, you're most welcome to follow up with us afterward. With that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to our CEO, Steve MacDonald. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Mark. I thought I'd begin talking a bit about CCUS, because CCUS is gaining increased traction, not just in Alberta, but worldwide, as a critical solution for achieving net zero emissions, while supporting continued economic growth. It can be applied in a number of ways and across a range of sectors, offering the potential to contribute, directly or indirectly, to emissions reductions in almost all parts of the global energy system. Consequently, progress in developing and deploying CCUS technologies in one sector could have significant spillover benefits for other sectors and applications, including for technological learning, cost reductions, and infrastructure development. There really are four main ways in which CCUS can contribute to the transition of the global energy system: by tackling emissions from existing energy assets, by providing a platform for low carbon hydrogen production, as a solution for sectors with hard to abate emissions, and for removing carbon directly from the atmosphere. Large facility operators, like many of you on this webinar, have expressed interest in accelerating and deploying these technologies. And you've asked for greater upfront government support to help de-risk investments. Provincial and federal policies are under consideration to respond to this need. Alberta, of course, has launched its hydrogen strategy and a request for proposals to develop carbon sequestering hubs. The federal government has committed to an investment tax credit for capital invested in CCUS projects, as well as funding through NRCan and the Strategic Innovation Fund Net Zero Accelerator. Clearly, the policy and financial landscape is evolving, but we are not well served by waiting for all the pieces to fall into place to take action. We need to make sure there are viable projects in the pipeline as further policies come into play. Not only does this call continue the momentum in this key technology space, it also incents and inspires shared learnings. Justin will talk more about our expectations for collaboration. It's also important to note that we've come a long way in setting the conditions for success for CCUS projects. Alberta has a robust carbon pricing system, the tier system, that creates certainty for industry in the long term. Canada, like I said, is committed to tax and other incentives that are critical to unlocking private investment. And most importantly, countries around the world have set very ambitious global climate targets and timelines that will require accelerated innovation across the board. And CCUS is key to achieving these targets, and not just in Alberta, but internationally. Accelerating innovation will reduce costs and ensure that critical emerging technologies become commercial, including in sectors where emissions are hard to abate and for carbon removal. It gets us beyond ideas to the heavy lifting of design, engineering, and final investment decisions. I'll talk more specifically about ERA. Since 2009, ERA has invested the proceeds from carbon pricing on large emitters to reduce GHGs and strengthen the competitiveness of new and existing industries in Alberta. Our funding is sourced from Alberta's large emitters who are required to reduce their emissions to meet targets under Alberta's tier regulations. We provide a clear line of sight from these funds to investments in the technology solutions needed to help achieve both emission reductions and economic growth. Since 2009, we have committed $809 million toward 220 projects worth $6.5 billion. We require a one-to-one matching investment from private sources. Historically, we have significantly exceeded this requirement. In fact, for every dollar invested by ERA, another 7 is invested by industry. And having significant private skin in the game is important to ensure industry and investors see there is a market demand for the technology. Last year alone, we leveraged over $2 billion in public and private funding. In terms of outcomes, our projections show cumulative project emission reductions of nearly 43 million tons by 2030. The results of our investments are of significant importance in telling the ESG story in Alberta and demonstrating climate action. On the slide, you will see our 4 strategic investments areas cover all sectors: cleaner oil and gas, low-emitting electricity supply and transportation, food, fiber, and bioindustries, and low-carbon industrial processes and products. And our investments are putting people to work. Job creation is essential to Alberta, and our modeling suggests that our investments will support over 31,000 person-year jobs by 2025 and contribute $4.6 billion to Alberta's GDP. These numbers jump to 43,000 and $6 billion, respectively, on a national level. I'll also add there's an estimated $1 billion net economic benefit of avoided climate change damages by 2030 from our investments. And we fund projects in 2 ways. First, through our targeted challenges. A few recent examples are highlighted here: our Shovel Ready Challenge, our Natural Gas Challenge, and our Food Farming and Forestry Challenges. Challenges are guided by market needs and our technology roadmap. Our potential future calls for proposals are outlined in our annual business plan. We also have our Partnership Intake Program, an initiative designed to increase the efficiency of our funding processes. It supports promising technologies outside of our funding calls, and it allows us to work closely with our trusted partner network. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Justin.
Thanks, Steve. So like you just heard, ERA is making $30 million available in funding for the Carbon Capture Kickstart design and engineering funding call. Alberta has played a leading role in scaling up and commercializing CCUS technologies in the past. The global CCUS industry is now advancing quickly around the world, recognizing how critical CCUS is to meet our net zero targets. CCUS is especially critical in jurisdictions like Alberta with multiple large industrial point sources of emissions and great geology for safe long-term CO2 sequestration. This global and national recognition of the importance of CCUS is good news for Alberta. However, barriers to implementing large-scale projects remain, including the high capital costs and challenges around site-specific technology integration. Kickstarting site-specific solutions is an important step in delivering on local and global climate ambitions. The investments supported through this call will help develop critical insights, build momentum, and accelerate decision-making for industrial-scale carbon capture projects in Alberta. This call for proposals supports feasibility studies, or pre-FEED, as well as front-end engineering and design studies, FEED studies. It is open to studies focused on specific carbon capture, site-specific carbon capture, direct carbon conversion, and carbon transportation hubs in Alberta. In this call, ERA funding will only be provided for studies. No capital costs will be considered. All studies must pertain to a specific project in Alberta. We aren't looking for generic, non-facility specific proposals. ERA will identify opportunities to leverage funding through this call with support from other funding agencies like NRCan. NRCan's recent intake for CCUS front-end engineering and design, or FEED studies, through their Energy Innovation Program was oversubscribed, with a total of 96 EOI submissions received. ERA was part of the expert technical committee that reviewed these projects, especially the Alberta projects, and the demand from Alberta was significant. We continue to work closely with NRCan to explore co-funding opportunities to maximize funding potential and optimize the overall portfolio of projects. By supporting these carbon capture and transport studies, ERA hopes to achieve a few things. Improve understanding of the current costs associated with large-scale adoption of carbon capture to better inform investment decisions. Provide industry and government with increased lines of sight to the feasibility and integration requirements of large-scale CCUS projects in Alberta. De-risk the initiation of industrial-scale carbon capture projects and accelerate the substantial follow-on investment that's needed. Build on Alberta's capabilities and develop a qualified workforce familiar with CCUS technologies, enhancing Alberta's position as a leader in this area. And finally, increase coordination with the Government of Alberta's recently announced carbon sequestration hub approach. Some examples of carbon capture technologies that could be considered in this call include chemical absorption and concentration of CO2 in a cyclic manner, such as amine-based carbon capture, physical concentration and purification of CO2 via cryogenics, pressure swing, or the use of sorbent materials, oxy-fuel combustion to produce a pure CO2 stream, including required upstream technologies such as oxygen plants, direct capture and separation of CO2 streams generated from non-combustion industrial processes, and emerging capture solutions, including chemical looping combustion or direct sequestration of CO2 in on-site carbon utilization processes. The underlying technologies funded in this call must be at a sufficient level of technical and commercial development that they are ready for commercial scale projects at an actual industrial site. Applicants must clearly identify and justify the readiness of the technology in their proposals. The minimum scale of capture projects that we're looking for is a capture rate of 200 kilotons of CO2 annually. This call is also open to transportation network projects, where the minimum scale is an annual transport volume of at least 1 million tons of CO2, and these transport projects must include multiple capture sites. I will add, this call is focused on accelerating emissions reductions from existing sources. Only studies targeting existing facilities are eligible, with the exception of direct air capture or transportation hub projects. Proposals will not be accepted for capture projects at new facilities or major facility expansions. Nature-based carbon sequestration projects are also not eligible for this call. And finally, projects with existing funding from ERA, either completed or active, are also not eligible. In their report titled The Need for Feed, the International CCS Knowledge Center identifies the following stages for CCUS projects: understanding, feasibility study, front-end engineering and design or FEED study, final investment decision, implementation, including detailed design, and operation. As you can see on the slide, in this call, we are targeting studies at the feasibility and or FEED stage of development. We encourage studies that build upon existing work, such as performing a FEED study for a project where a feasibility or pre-feasibility study has already been completed. That said, proposals must demonstrate how the study will advance the project beyond the current state. Studies focused on updating previous work only are not eligible. We welcome proposals from all applicable industrial sectors, including power generation, cement production, oil and gas, industrial manufacturing, such as petrochemicals or fertilizer, and more. These proposals must target a specific large final emitter site in Alberta. We invite technology developers, industry operators, industrial associations, small and medium-sized enterprises, municipalities, and others to apply or collaborate on applications. Partnerships are encouraged, especially with post-secondary and research institutions. This is really important. Partnerships offer multiple benefits, including the attraction and training of highly skilled workers and enhanced knowledge sharing. While applicant organizations and partners are not required to be from Alberta, all studies must include the Alberta site host as a lead applicant or significant partner. Collaboration between partners can often represent a strong value proposition by demonstrating opportunities for technology validation, commercialization, and sharing results for impacts beyond just the specific project. Collaborations between facilities within a region can also represent high value propositions by increasing the scale of total reductions and enabling cost savings through common infrastructure and economies of scale. One final note here: while there are no restrictions on the number of proposals that can be submitted by any one applicant, we do strongly encourage you to be selective and bring forward only the most promising and high quality submissions. As Steve noted, knowledge sharing is a critical part of this call. Funding recipients are required to report on project outcomes, achievements, and lessons learned, including GHG reductions, job creation, and other environmental, economic, and social benefits. We cannot understate the value of this. The purpose of this call is to provide valuable information to support investment decisions and policy and program design for Alberta and Canada. We expect to have more proposals than funds available, so knowledge sharing is one of the important ways to ensure that funding supports broader advancements in Alberta beyond just the funded studies. Successful applicants will be expected to commit to the following at a minimum: publication of study learnings and key outcomes following completion, publication of the completed study, confidentiality to protect equipment supplier intellectual property will of course be considered. Recipients will participate in an annual confidential roundtable session to discuss and share learnings and best practices across projects. We'll also host a wrap-up public lessons learned event to broadly share high-level outcomes and learnings. Post-project reports to inform ERA on project outcomes will also be required. For this call, we are partnering with the CCS Knowledge Center. Funding recipients can engage the Knowledge Center for technical and/or regulatory advice and support. ERA will directly fund a portion of this engagement above and beyond the direct financial contribution to the project. Proponents are welcome to work with the Knowledge Center directly, both in the preparation of their applications and once projects are selected. The Knowledge Center is available to answer questions at the end of today's session if needed. The Knowledge Center is independent of ERA and is not involved in the adjudication of proposals for this call. In terms of funding, as I mentioned, we have a maximum of $30 million available. And as is our standard practice, we will match eligible expenses with private funds on up to a 1-to-1 basis. ERA will contribute up to 50% of the project costs to a maximum of $5 million. The minimum funding request is $1 million for a $2 million project size. Applicants may request up to $7.5 million if the proposal involves a consortium of multiple participants for a single study, covering the entire CO2 value chain from capture to sequestration or removal through utilization. We have a fairly detailed eligible expenses guideline document on our website if you'd like to read more about what is considered eligible and what is not. This will help you in the preparation of your budget as part of the proposal. In terms of the submission process, we often receive 10 times more funding requests than we can actually fund with the budget available. We also saw a huge demand with NRCan's call for CCUS feed studies, so it's important that all applicants make a strong case for their project. I'll run through our submission and evaluation process here, and on the next slide, I'll talk about the timelines of the process. As you can see in this diagram, we have a slightly modified evaluation process for this call compared to past ERA calls. This recognizes the need for reduced evaluation associated with studies. We will accept expressions of interest from all interested applicants. ERA will then review all EOIs in a competitive process to establish a short list of strong opportunities. Applicants on the shortlist will be invited to present to ERA's expert review panel. The review panel will then provide funding recommendations to ERA's board of directors, who will make the final funding decisions. The entire process is overseen by an independent fairness monitor that reports directly to ERA's board of directors. Once board decisions are made, we enter into legal agreements with successful applicants that detail the terms and obligations of each party as it relates to our contribution and completion of the project. In terms of timelines, funding decisions for this call will be made in June of this year. The application deadline is Thursday, March 3rd, 2022 at 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. That's 5 p.m. sharp. The online system automatically closes submission functionality at the deadline. Please note that we will not be extending the deadline and we will not accept late submissions. This is a matter of fairness to all applicants and we take this very seriously. Once you've submitted your application, you will receive an email from the system to confirm your submission has been received. If you do not receive that confirmation, please go back into the system to double check your submission was properly completed. Shortlisted projects will then be notified by late April of this year. Presentations will take place in May, and final funding decisions, as I said, will be made in June. And finally, the timeline for the study themselves. All studies must be completed by December 31st, 2024. A few tips on preparing a successful submission. First, I recommend that you start the process now. From now until the submission deadline is about 5 weeks. We know that it doesn't take the full 5 weeks to put together an application. However, it does take time to forge partnerships, get internal approvals, and allocate resources. While you don't need to have every internal approval or partnership finalized by the submission deadline, the further along you are in the process, the better off you'll be in terms of demonstrating your proposal is achievable and ready to advance. Since all submissions need to be completed through our online portal, please go there to register an account right away if you don't have one already. The system is already up and running. Next, and I really can't emphasize this enough, read the call for expressions of interest guidelines document that's on the website. All the information that we're sharing here today is in that guidelines document. It's not a long document and it answers most questions that we get on a regular basis. If you have a project that is not eligible or doesn't fit with this call for proposals, you can save yourself a lot of time by reading the guidelines document and figuring that out early on. In particular, please review the evaluation criteria within the guideline document. These are the criteria upon which each proposal will be evaluated and shortlisted, and each of these criteria have different weightings. While all sections of the application are important and need to be addressed, I would encourage you to consider putting more effort towards those with the higher weighting. Building on that point, when you're completing the expression of interest document, it's important to use clear language and to address all the points laid out in the template. Our evaluation team consists of subject matter experts, but if they can't decipher the information that's necessary to make a qualified assessment, or if the submission is filled with extraneous information, they won't have the confidence to move the application forward in the process. There's a 20-page limit, 8.5 by 11, to this expression of interest. This reflects our modified submission process. Typically, our EOI requests are 8 pages, but this is a one-stage process, so all text, graphics, and tables must be included in the 20 pages. Any extra pages beyond the 20 will be removed from the document and will not be considered by the evaluators. We also have the option for projects to attach an NRCan submission, the FPP submissions, which are due at the end of this month, plus an appendix addressing ERA-specific information that's not included in the NRCan FPP. This appendix may be no more than 8 pages if you choose to go this route. If this applies to you, please reach out to our team directly for further instructions on how to optimize those 8 pages. And last, but certainly not least, do not wait until the last day to submit your application. In past challenges, we have lost good opportunities because of deadlines that were missed. This is a matter of fairness, as I mentioned previously, to all applicants, so we have to be quite firm on it. If you do have technical issues during the submission process, our ERIMS team is happy to help resolve the technical issues. We try to be responsive to the requests that come in. However, if you wait until the last day, it's possible we will not be able to address all the last-minute issues that may arise. Before I move on to questions, I want to take a minute to talk about leveraging funding from trusted partners. During the submission process, you'll have the opportunity to authorize us to share your submissions with our trusted partners to leverage available funding, and I encourage you to select this option. As we've mentioned, ERA works in partnership with other funding organizations like Alberta Innovates, SDTC, and NRCan, and these partnership agreements include the ability to share applications between organizations. If you agree to this in the system, ERA will only share your application with partners where we have a non-disclosure agreement in place and for the sole purpose of exploring further funding leverage. Okay, if you've made it this far and you're still awake, this is your opportunity to ask questions for Steve or me, and we also have Conway Nelson on the line from the CCS Knowledge Center to answer questions. So I'll throw things over to Mark to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Justin. We've already seen some questions come in, and I'm sure there will be many more. But as a quick reminder, please type your questions into the questions pane of the webinar control panel. That's typically on the right-hand side of your screen. But I'll dive right in as you continue to put your questions in. So there have been a couple questions come in around the 200,000 ton per year threshold. And I know there's some language in the guidelines document, but I'm wondering if you can clarify what that means and perhaps why a minimum threshold was established.
Sure.
Justin, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll start with the second part, the why. So as we mentioned, this call is really targeted at accelerating large-scale investment in CCUS projects at existing facilities. So we're looking for scale of emissions reductions. So we know that there are lots of CCS technologies that are maybe ready for pilot or demonstration, and ERA in the past has funded a lot of those. This is a different type of call. We're targeting the large-scale sequestration or capture opportunities, and we do know there are a number of those at Alberta facilities. So we're looking for magnitude of impact. And then, sorry, Mark, what was the second part of that, or the first part of that question?
It was really just to clarify what we mean by that threshold. These are captured, compressed, sequestered.
So projects do not need to include the sequestration component, although of course that's encouraged. So that 200,000 tons of CO2, that's the amount of CO2 leaving the site in the pipeline, if you will. So we know that on a net emissions reduction basis, there will be some deductions off of that if you go through the offset protocol in the tier guidelines. But this is looking at the actual volume of the CO2 that's leaving the site.
Thanks very much, Justin. We've had a number of questions come in here, and you talked about this already, Justin, but I think it might be worthwhile if you and Steve can clarify a little bit about the site locations. I mean, understanding that we're funding design and engineering here, can you talk a little bit about and maybe reiterate for folks on the line what we mean in terms of site restrictions and where these sites need to be located?
Sure, I can start, and then Steve, you can maybe jump in with some higher level justification if you want. But the purpose of this is to accelerate the deployment of large scale capture in Alberta. So we want you to tie it to a specific site because we're trying to get these sites to final investment decision in an accelerated way, ideally so that projects can be up and running by 2030 to contribute to the federal climate goals. So one of the missing pieces of information in the system right now is there's a lot of high level literature and estimates on how much CO2 could be reduced through CCUS, but we're missing that next level of detail on for each particular site, what's it going to take, what's the cost going to be, what are the technology limitations or constraints, what are the specific infrastructure and geographical requirements. So we're trying to focus this study on, or focus this call on studies that will really help solve that or publish that information, dive into those details that are kind of the next level of requirement to get to final investment decisions.
Yeah,
Steve, do you want to add anything?
yeah, no, that's a great answer. And the only thing I'd add is that there's a lot of activity in this space, and the more information we have, the better choices that can be made in the marketplace. So that's a very big part of this. And then the second part is the learnings and the shared learnings. It's important for Alberta industry to learn from them. You know, the learnings will be applicable outside our province, but this really is about accelerating one of the key technology solutions that Alberta needs to contribute to Canada's GHG reduction goals, as Justin said. So we need the benefit in Alberta directly in terms of GHG reductions, but the learnings and the ability to deploy those learnings across Canada and around the world are the other benefit.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Justin and Steve, both for that one. I'm going to jump to, there's a few related questions, but I'm going to jump to another question right now that's a little bit of a different vein, and that is around eligibility for entities that have received funding in the past. And you mentioned something about this, and I think it was project related, but maybe if it's all right, clarify if applicants or any entity has received funding from ERA in the past, are they eligible to apply, or did we hear it correctly that they're not eligible to apply?
Yeah, I probably should have been a bit more specific in my phrasing there. So we're not looking to fund the same study or the same project that we've already funded. So we know that, you know, it's a small world. There's only so many industrial facilities. ERA has been operating for 12 years. So by now, most facilities have had some funding for some project. We're not saying you're excluded if you've ever received $1 from ERA. We're saying that we're not looking to fund projects that already have funding from ERA. And that relates to the other point I made about advancing rather than just updating. So if your project is, you did a feasibility study in 2012 and you need to dust it off and, you know, translate it to 2022 dollars, we're not really interested in that. We're looking for the next stage of study to advance your projects. We're looking for you to show us how will this get you to final investment decision on these projects.
Thanks very much. So there have been a few questions that have come in around, and this is related to the site location question previously, but this is a little bit more around the technology and the applicant entities. Can technology providers, for example, from outside of Canada apply? And if so, under what conditions?
Yeah,
Justin?
so we don't restrict who can apply, but as I mentioned, you need to have a real site in Alberta, and the operator or owner of that site needs to be one of the partners on the application. So the technology provider or someone else could be the lead applicant, but there's a section in the submission to identify all the partners and their roles. And one of those prominent partners, if it's not the lead applicant, has to be the site host where the project will be implemented.
Yeah, and what I'd add on that is we want to bring the best ideas to Alberta. So in fact, we encourage applicants from outside the province to bring their technologies, to find that Alberta-based partner, to actually deploy them and scale it up. So we really encourage that. We've funded technology providers from around the world in our previous calls, and that'll continue. We want the best ideas to be deployed in Alberta.
And maybe one thing to add, if you are in that situation, if you're a technology provider or someone else and you're looking for a host, the large final emitters in Alberta that's public information. The names and even contact information for those facilities is available both on the Government of Alberta and Government of Canada websites.
Great. We've got a couple of questions here related to these previous questions, and that is around a little bit around the 200,000 ton threshold. And specifically, I don't know if you talked about this in your slides, Justin, but would it be all right or eligible for 2 or 5 or 10 or even 100 sites to aggregate their flue gas or CO2 capture for a single project to meet that 200,000 threshold?
So yeah, not just allowed, but encouraged. We really do hope to see some interesting applications from consortiums of projects, and that can include multiple sites bundling together to meet that threshold. And that applies both to the capture, where there's the 200,000 ton threshold, or the transportation hub projects with the 1 megaton of CO2 threshold. So we're looking for the big projects, but we recognize, there are a lot of industrial clusters in Alberta where partnerships between facilities within a particular geography might be a great opportunity to advance a project. So we're looking for scale, but not every single site within a consortium needs to be at that scale. It's the total volume of CO2 that we're looking at with those thresholds.
Thanks, Justin. We have a couple questions here around the partnership specifically or work with NRCan. Maybe the first one is around fund matching. A couple of questions have come in around the one-to-one fund matching and how that might be affected if funding from the federal government is also received. Can you still receive funding from ERA, and how does that fund matching work?
Yeah, I can start on that. Okay,
Sure.
go ahead, Justin.
No, you go, Steve. Sorry.
No problem at all. Yeah, we really do want to encourage leveraging sources from the federal government. We see that partnership as important. They have significant resources, and we want to ensure that those resources are helping Alberta meet its climate goals. So 2 things in response to that is, one is that the one-to-one matching of our funds, we still expect to see private dollars match our dollars, but we will stack federal dollars on top of that. So I'll give you an example. If the project costs $3 million, $1 million could come from us, $1 million private, and $1 million feds. So that stacking's both encouraged, and we'll explore that with the federal government. What we don't want to see is a project that requires 100% public money. Again, the point I made in my opening comments is we expect to see the private sector and the marketplace step up to say, this is an important project. We have skin in the game. We're an equal partner with you on advancing this, and we'll take on the risks and share the benefits. So hopefully that answers that question. We do allow a stacking, but we still need to see that one-to-one matching of our dollars with private dollars.
Thanks, Steve. Justin, did you want to add anything there?
Well, I'll maybe just add one thing, which is we're not doing this for the sake of the studies. We're doing this to advance the actual capture projects and transport projects. So if you're really just scraping by and pinching pennies to cover the cost of the study, that doesn't give us a lot of confidence that the final project, which is going to be an order of magnitude more money, or 2 orders of magnitude in some cases, is in good shape to advance. So in addition to our normal rationale for wanting private unencumbered cash contributions, the nature of this call, where we're looking to unlock much larger future investments, makes that private contribution and commitment even more important, I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Thanks both. So then the second question on that same vein around working with NRCan is it possible to articulate a little bit the process from here on out if someone's already applied through the NRCan full project proposal? Justin, do
Sure,
you want to start that
I
one?
can take that, yeah. So NRCan is one of our trusted partners, and we've been working closely with them on a number of things, but especially this CCUS, the design of our call and supporting their own feed call. We recognize that these are complementary and even somewhat overlapping calls in the space. So the intention is to enable people to springboard or leverage the work that they've already done for the NRCan call. If you were invited to submit a full project proposal, the deadline for that is this week. I think it may have already passed. Sorry, I don't have the exact date. So we invite you to use that information and just supplement it with a little bit of ERA specific information, up to 8 pages as an appendix. And like I mentioned, if you're in that situation, so if you're one of the projects that submitted an FPP to the NRCan process, feel free to get in touch with us, and we can have a further conversation about what to focus on in your 8 pages of supplemental information. It's not a requirement. You do have the option to do the full 20 pages and just submit a standalone application, but we're just trying to reduce a little bit of the administrative burden for folks that are participating in both calls.
Great, thanks. There's another question here, and this is about a little bit about what ERA can do to try and make those connections and build those partnerships. You know, I think the question's more specifically, do we have any sort of matchmaking service? Could we partner, for example, if someone applies with a project for a carbon capture proposal and someone else with a CO2 transportation, do we have an opportunity to kind of pair these groups up or matchmake? Did you want to jump in on this one, Steve, first?
Yeah, yes, we could help to create those partnerships. Again, this is a very tight timeline, and if there's not a partnership in place, if conversations haven't progressed significantly, the ability to turn on a dime and do this industrial scale application is going to be pretty challenging. It would suggest to me that that technology might not be ready for sort of that commercial scale demonstration. It might be a little early. That said, if you have a project and a technology and you do need some help on knocking on doors, for sure we're open to those conversations. And maybe Justin can talk a bit about the CCUS Knowledge Center and their network, and maybe there's some help that could be provided through that door that we've opened.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So just building on that, I think it's an interesting proposition. We're not going to do all your work for you, so we do encourage people to make their own calls and do what they can to try to find partnerships. But we recognize, and the government of Alberta, through their sequestration hub policy, recognizes Alberta is better off the more collaboration and alignment we get between these projects, the more we can use common infrastructure and that sort of thing. So it's encouraged in the application itself. If you have identified some partnerships, please highlight that. But that's also a thing we're looking to accomplish with the knowledge sharing components of the call. So those roundtable discussions will enable some sharing of learnings, as well as identifying complementary projects. And then these studies themselves will inform those next stages of partnership formation as people look to progress their actual investment decisions on the final project. So we're certainly interested in pushing things towards that coordinated partnership approach, and that'll happen at a variety of stages through the process.
Perfect. We've got a few more questions here. Thanks very much. The questions keep rolling in. So I'm going to ask this one's maybe a more specific eligibility. And you may have spoken to this, Justin, but I don't recall if it was on the slide. Um, can you comment around the eligibility of direct air capture technologies?
Yeah, I alluded to it, but I maybe wasn't super explicit, and I don't think there was a bullet on the slide. So direct air capture is eligible and is exempt by its very nature from that requirement to pair with an existing industrial facilities. And this is essentially a recognition of a couple of things. One, in some cases, it may be cheaper and more efficient to do direct air capture on top of a good utilization or sequestration opportunity than it is to chase a bunch of small distributed sources of CO2. So there's a kind of virtual networking effect that you can get through a direct air capture project. And secondly, we're seeing globally that direct air capture could be an important strategic technology as we chase the net zero goal. There could be a lot of money in direct air capture, and it could be an important value add way for Alberta to use its pore space resource. So we've included it as an eligible project for both of those reasons. The scale requirement still holds, so a direct air capture proposal would have to be at that 200 kiloton per year size. And that's really, again, to create some fairness between the industrial capture and the direct air capture projects, and to focus in on the types of technologies that are ready for prime time, ready for commercial deployment.
Did you have anything to add on that one, Steve? Okay. There's maybe a question for Justin. I'll go back to you on this one. Can you talk a little bit more about the role of the CCS Knowledge Center in this? And we haven't had any direct questions for Conway on the line. I'm wondering if you could just expand on your previous comments around the role that they can play.
Sure, and maybe I should have provided a little bit more of an introduction as well. This is in the guidelines document, but the CCS Knowledge Center is a kind of a unique group in Canada and a unique resource that we wanted to leverage for this. They've been intimately involved in the CCS projects that have already been deployed in Canada to date, especially the Boundary Dam project in Saskatchewan. So they have some unique knowledge because of that participation. They've also been participating in knowledge sharing type activities around the world for the last decade. So we're looking to leverage that experience and technical capability and make that available to the participants in this process. So it's basically a add-on to the direct funding that we're offering. We're offering to fund. We have a contract with the Knowledge Center that we're in the process of finalizing that would make their services available for a certain number of hours to each of the successful proponents. So that the value to you is some access to their expertise and unique knowledge, as well as some free consulting money. And then the proponents of projects can choose to continue working with the Knowledge Center beyond the specific supports that are provided by ERA as part of the call. So it's really just looking to leverage some of the expertise that exists in Canada and to further foster that ongoing knowledge sharing throughout the ecosystem, because that'll be so critically important as we look to scale up CCUS deployment in Canada and around the world.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. We've got a few questions here about technology readiness level. And in essence, I guess it's sort of a two-part question. First, is there any restrictions around the TRL? Understanding that there's a capture threshold that we've talked about. Are there any restrictions around the technology readiness level of technologies that can be put forward in this? And then the second part to that is there any preference on ERA's side around, are we looking for more, a little more newer, riskier, slightly lower TRL technologies, or we're looking for more well-established, commercially available, previously deployed? Any comments around that?
Sure. So we haven't specified a TRL number to say, you have to be 8 or above. What we've said is the call will be predominantly focused on technologies at a high technology readiness level. And then the studies are looking at integrating those technologies into the specific facility. So it can still be a first of a kind type application, but the technology has to be ready for commercial scale deployment. We're not looking for studies that would support a pilot or a demonstration type facility. These studies are looking to advance real capture projects that will deliver CO2 reductions at scale as the next stage of the project. So it's, again, a little bit different from other ERA calls where we're looking to advance people in that TRL 6 to 9 range and get them ready for commercial deployment. This is kind of looking at that final step of doing the study work to deploy technologies at scale and hopefully get final investment decisions in relatively short order.
And what I'd add is that as people consider whether they'll apply, is, as I said in my opening comments, there's very ambitious targets with very ambitious timelines out there in terms of GHG reductions. 2030 is not far away. So this call really is about accelerating the deployment of technologies that allow Alberta and Canada to reach 2030 targets and 2050 targets. So keep that in mind. 2030 is not far away. So it really is about de-risking initiation of industrial scale carbon capture and accelerating substantial follow-up investments so we get steel in the ground and deployment of real projects. So keep that in mind as you consider buying.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks
Steve.
both. And you know, I think that in a large part answers this next question, Steve, but I don't know if you have anything else to add. The question is around the sort of the rationale or the driving force behind switching tacks a little bit and funding engineering and design as opposed to typically ERA funds capital construction commissioning projects.
No, that's a great question, because this is a bit of a change because the world is changing so quickly. And as we sat with our board and had a conversation about where can we play, it's clear that there's a lot of policy decisions and a lot of project conversations going on. And we saw a need to accelerate those and make them real and to advance that early stage work. We're not abandoning the de-risking of innovation by any means, but right now, there's a lot of conversations around billions of dollars of investment moving forward. And we saw that it was important to help one get the heavy lifting of design and engineering started now, not waiting for all the dust to settle, because we will never meet our targets in terms of timelines. And equally important, we thought that our money would unlock the sharing of that information. Again, given the size of the task and the timelines around that task, we need to act together. And our funds will encourage that, incent it, inspire that collaboration. So that's why this is a bit unique. And I do want to reinforce, we're not abandoning sort of our core mandate of identifying and accelerating innovation that's not ready for sort of commercial. That'll continue. You know, stay tuned for our next call that'll be in that space. But we think this is an important piece of the puzzle to make sure Alberta and Alberta projects are ready to take advantage of what we think are going to be significant announcements in both the policy and the financing space in the coming months and weeks.
Thanks, Steve. Justin, did you want to add anything? Or we've got about 5 minutes left. It'd be great to get in a couple more questions.
I think you can go to the next one, Mark.
Sure, thanks, Justin. And maybe I'll start with you for this one, Justin. And that's, we've got some questions around the requirement for this to be related to or engineering and design for existing facilities, and sort of the kind of the crossover point between new facilities and existing facilities, I guess you could think of as facility expansions. Do you have any thoughts around how this might play into a facility that either a new facility that's under construction or an expansion at an existing facility that might be happening? Any thoughts around that, Justin?
Sure. Yeah, we've seen a lot of exciting announcements in Alberta over the last years or even months about new facilities, new lines of business that include capture as an integrated part of their design. That's fantastic. That's the type of thing we want to see. This target is not, or this call is not focused on that though. We're really focusing in on reducing emissions from existing sources. So that's the rationale behind saying the capture project has to be associated with capturing CO2 from an existing industrial facility in Alberta. So we've excluded the studies for new projects or new expansions, partly because we expect that the more efficient way to do capture at those new facilities or new expansions is to design the capture right in with it as you're designing that facility. So we think that the incentives are already there and the systems are already there to do that design. The gap in the system that we're trying to address is more with the existing sources in Alberta.
Thanks, Justin. That's very helpful. Okay, the next question, and we'll see if we have time for one more after this, but the next question is around facilitation of partnerships. And maybe I'll take a bit of liberties and reword the question slightly. The question is around whether there's a platform, or do we have a platform, or do we know of any platforms or networks or anything that could help today's attendees identify and facilitate partnerships for the purpose of this call. Understanding the timelines are tight, but are there any platforms where potentially these connections can be made or facilitation of partnerships can happen? Steve, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we don't formally, as I think Justin mentioned, sort of do the heavy lifting of creating the business case, finding customers for innovators. We're always open to conversations, but again, recognize this is a 5-week deadline period to actually put together a proposal. If you're an innovator and you haven't yet had conversations with a customer for your technology, I'd be concerned on your state of readiness to actually compete with those projects that have all the critical pieces in place. So I would say someone who's asking that question, who has an innovation, hasn't been successful yet in finding a partner to deploy it at a commercial scale, talk to us maybe outside of this call, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you. But I'd be very cautious about the ability to be successful if that critical piece is not in place before you start writing up your application. Justin, you may have something to
add. I don't think I have a lot to add. I think, as I mentioned, the information is largely public on where the emissions are and who's responsible for those. And there are other services that operate in this space. So, you can talk to the Invest Albertas or the industrial associations or things like that to get some of that matching. But I think you're absolutely right, Steve, that's great work to do in general. It's probably very tight to get that work done in time to get a proposal in for this call. There may be cases where an industrial facility is looking at evaluating 2 or 3 capture technologies and they haven't finalized all their technology sources. That'll be one of the things that they do through the course of the study. And that would be a great opportunity for some further pairing up with strategic partners that maybe have a technology that was not fully ready to have it in the proposal, but is something that's solved as part of the work that's done in the study.
Great. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Justin. That is our time for today. Thanks to everyone for joining us and for your insightful questions. As I mentioned, a recording of the webinar will be available on our website. We're aiming for before the end of this week for that to be uploaded to the site. If you have any further questions and you can't seem to find the answers in our guidelines or supporting materials, you're most welcome to email our technical team using the applications inbox shown here on the slide, which is monitored by a handful of ERA team members. On behalf of ERA, all the best and thank you once again.